Hey guys, my name is Ryan and welcome to HitScan. Miska did a video yesterday going over some new details with Overwatch 2 and it raised more questions than answers in that case. On the backside of that video, I did want to go over an interview that I did with Chacko Sonny, who is an executive producer at Blizzard, on Overwatch, and Michael Chu, who is the head of story and development, I guess, for the Overwatch universe. There's some really key questions in here. I think the most important one is, why is Overwatch 2 a sequel and not an expansion? Certainly from all of the details that we've been hearing recently, that question becomes more and more confusing. What's life going to be like for Overwatch 1 until Overwatch 2 comes out? And here Blizzard compared the new modes for Overwatch 2 to Diablo's adventure mode, which I found really interesting. This was like a 45-minute interview, so I've cut out some of the fat, such as what's it like to finally announce Overwatch 2? You know, it's of course really exciting for them, but the question I asked to begin with was, when did the plan for Overwatch 2 begin? Was it around the time of Retribution? When that came out, that Blizzard realized that they wanted to do a PvE-focused game?
It's probably, I don't think I could point to a specific date. I think it's a little more permeable than that. I think, there's sort of two parts of that. One part is our desire to explore PvE gameplay. I think that was something, it's obviously something that people have been really interested in. People have been asking us about it. I think on the team, it's something that we've been really interested in, but we were taking a slow, graduating approach to exploring it. But that said, the other part of that, which is the story, when we started making Overwatch, very shortly after we started developing the initial heroes and the initial world pitch and kind of the general state, we asked ourselves, where is this story going to go? And just so that we knew where we were going to point all the content that we made for the next several years, it was really important for us to have an idea of where we thought that story was going. And so the seeds that are going to someday become the Overwatch 2 story, and what the kind of some of the beats that you've already seen, we set down quite a while ago. Hopefully are already starting to get the sense is that those 3 archive missions were chosen for very specific reasons, and they are all integral to what is to come.
Yeah, 100% sort of echoing what Michael said. Certainly as long as I've been on the team, the idea of being able to tell a bigger narrative and explain kind of what's happening with these characters has been paramount, and everyone that I've talked to on the team is like, hey, we have this incredible universe that we know everybody wants to live in, let's tell some story in it. And from like a development or a production perspective, the stuff that you're seeing or have seen with Retribution and Uprising and Storm Rising is definitely incremental steps along the way for us of how we build the capabilities to allow us to tell story in the way that we want to. And that was a very deliberate effort on our part to kind of lay the framework and the foundation for that.
Yeah, I mean, we learned a lot from making those 3 missions. It may not be immediately apparent, but we were testing out hypotheses and experimenting with different things on kind of bigger and smaller, more granular levels to see how we could actually achieve being able to tell, PvE stories.
Yeah.
Hami brought up the fact that the end boss, I suppose it would be from the PvE event, had like World of Warcraft mechanics when it comes to dungeons and raids in that game. He wondered if that was something that we'd see a little bit more of.
There are technical improvements that have been made to support the aspirations that we have for this PvE experience. And at a very base level, there are things like number of units on screen, right? And bigger map sizes, and supporting the ability to kind of stream in world content in a similar fashion that we do with other types of asset that is sort of foundational work. But on top of that, there's a ton of effort that goes into the AI and the behaviors for characters. And one of our engineers, Jan Mueller, I think has done a ton of work on that. There's a lot of other people on the team who have worked on that as well. And for that final encounter, it was one of those things that, man, we tuned that so much. And just getting those behaviors to feel right and feel appropriate and interact with the other characters, and really feeling like you and your teammates had the ability to kind of formulate a plan and a strategy for that type of a unit. It was a ton of work. And so that's a big piece of kind of the work that we're doing for Overwatch 2.
Previously in the interview, they mentioned that they looked at stats for Retribution and other Archives events for PvE content. I asked, what kind of stats did they look at? What are they trying to find from these events? Were there any areas that they wanted to double down on to make sure that this content was still replayable? Because as most of us know, I played Storm Rising once and that was it. Of course, Overwatch 2 has to be better.
And I think one of the things that we were setting out to, to learn about is, you have these stories and you have a game. Multiplayer games are extremely difficult to tell story in, and I think one of the things that we really wanted to experience and experiment with was how could we translate these bigger story ideas, and how would they translate into gameplay. And I think you can see a little bit of a progression, like with Uprising. We had a more complicated thing. There were a bunch of different objectives. They were very different. There's a lot of stuff going on there. And so that was interesting. We learned a lot about it, and I think if we were to do a more objective, complicated mission, we took a lot of learning away from that. But then you look at something like Retribution, which is structurally, like game mechanic wise, extremely simple, right? It's basically like, whoa, get out of here. And obviously it's more complicated than that. But that was an experiment to see like, well, okay, how does it work with less stuff? So, those are sort of the things that immediately pop to mind, but I feel like the missions are just littered with learnings like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton. I mean, again, not a stats-based answer, but I think we got a lot of good insight about how people encountered specials, units that had unique abilities, what was their way of engaging with them, which were the most effective ones, what were great, which were good, which were maybe not as good, and which do we have to tune and tweak and balance. The designers are constantly in that phase. I mean, that. Oh, yeah. Like we're constantly in this mode of like, hey, even though we thought it would play out this one way, maybe it didn't, and we need to tune it or tweak it.
I wasn't necessarily happy with this answer. They kind of went into an area that I didn't have interest in. I was looking at stats on how they kept people playing and what they intended to do to keep people interested. But I think the whole replayability factor of this game is still in its early development, which is a bit of a concern, but hopefully something that we find out more information on going into 2020. Lots of people are expecting PvE content to come out like an expansion, so a question was asked, I'm not sure who by, I didn't recognise the voice, whether Blizzard sort of pivoted this whole idea of doing a PvE expansion to something along the lines of a sequel.
It's always been the case that Overwatch 2 has been conceived of as a sequel. It's a brand new game, and when we look at the sort of just the sheer scope of what we're trying to achieve relative to even just what was in original Overwatch, it can be daunting as a production team. We look at it and go, all of those PvP maps, the heroes that we're trying to do, then multiple different parts of that player versus AI experience, the hero missions and the story missions, and then all of the new looks for the characters. There's so much that we're trying to do. I think we always thought of it as a sequel. Really, the approach that we're taking to sort of defining what that means from a product perspective is trying to respect the sort of the contribution of our community and the amount of time they've put into the game, ensure that all of their stuff comes across, ensure that we're not leaving anybody behind if they want to be able to participate and play with the entirety of that community. We just keep that community together. We've always thought of it as a sequel. We want Overwatch 10 years from now, 15 years from now, to be even bigger and have more ways for people to engage in it.
Hammy asked a good question. What's the difference between the story missions for Overwatch 2 and the hero missions? And who is also going to be getting story out of all of the cast within Overwatch?
At a basic level starting point, for the story missions are the ones that are very focused on telling the new Overwatch 2 story, expanding the plot lines that have begun. Yes, yeah, correct. And then hero missions are the kind of really replayable, choose different heroes, go up against a bunch of different objectives, stuff that's changing. One of the ways that we've described it, very much in the same kind of feeling as like a adventure mode of Diablo 3. Wow, the years. Yeah. And so that is the hero missions. As far as the kind of stories we're going to tell, we have 31 heroes at this point, and probably more to come. Yep. And all of those characters have stories that need to be told. There are different underlying plot threads that are going, but broadly I think that Overwatch 2 is the story of the return of Overwatch and how that will affect the different groups of people, and every character is a little bit different, but I think that they broadly fall into some different groups. I think there are the people who are a part of Overwatch, who saw it for many, many years, kind of the older generation, and how do they feel about the thing that they watched fall apart, come back. I think there are the sort of intermediate generation, the one that maybe had a little bit of Overwatch or didn't have all of the experience, like the Tracers and the Winstons and the Mercies, and how do they feel about Overwatch coming together?
Now, a couple of months ago, I mentioned that Blizzard are intentionally adding a lot of Talon members for a particular reason. There was a trend of Baptiste, Sigma being added into the game, Maximilian, that Predator bot, Noyan, all those kind of Talon characters that have been established a bit more. I wondered if that had anything to do with Overwatch 2 in the future there. We
really wanted to make sure that, there was some bench strength there. I feel like a Talon recruiter now. But we wanted to make sure that they were fleshed out also, and so that they would seem like a world group that would be able to stand up as a real threat for Overwatch. And yeah.
And this is literally just me talking to you about the characters in the game.
Oh yeah.
I love that there's so much depth there, and one of the great things about Talon, I feel like, is there's always so many interesting competing agendas.
Right.
And that makes for very interesting character interaction. You can tell a very really interesting story with those differing potential agendas, as opposed to just a single, everybody's aligned on one purpose.
The big question, what is life going to be like for Overwatch 1 until Overwatch 2 comes out?
Kind of the reality of development resources and sort of how we operate as a team. We're not a massive team, and I feel like the team does its best work, sort of kind of being very focused on individual goals. That implies there's some limit, right? Overwatch 2 is our core focus, but it does not mean that the live game won't get updates. And we've actually tuned the things that we're shooting for as development priorities based on how we've seen players respond to things in the past 3.5 years. So we're really pleased with the response to, say, something like Workshop, or something like Replay Viewer is another one that had a really good response, and Roll Queue as well was another one where we got a ton of interest and engagement in the game. And so using that information and sort of understanding kind of what are the things that move the needle for players, we're able to kind of carve out a path for development for the live game in the time between now and Overwatch 2.
Now, earlier on, as Michael Chu mentioned, he worked on Diablo 3 and was also involved in the adventure mode there. Now, of course, the big issue comparing Diablo to Overwatch is that Diablo has bigger systems, more established systems than we've seen in Overwatch 2. Not only talents, where there's a good amount, not as much as something like Path of Exile mind, but loot and gear. Is that something that we're going to see in Overwatch 2? Is it going to become a looter shooter of sorts?
I think one of the things about Overwatch, and it was one of the ideas behind the creation of the game that we really look at, is just the hero fantasy. Like, we have these heroes that we love, and the heroes are the core of the game. Like, they were the core of the PvP shooter, they were the core of how we make the abilities, how we tell stories. We usually tell hero-centric stories, and again, PvE is going to be about how do you play your hero characters in PvE. And I think that for the progression system, it's also very much about what is the fantasy of progressing these heroes. And I think that ultimately, it's still early. We're still working on a lot of things, but I think that's like kind of the guiding principle they're going after. We want you to feel like these are still these heroes, and these are the things that they're doing.
And I have the 4 or 5 characters I play regularly, but with that hero mission, sort of experience, man, I want to do that with every single character. I want to know exactly how I play, Reinhardt versus Mei versus Genji versus Soldier, all fully maxed out. And that'll be super interesting to kind of see and develop a skill around all of that fully expressed progression,
Before I get to the next question, this is something very quickly that Michael Chu said about the story of World of Warcraft.
Just like watching some of the World of Warcraft stuff, I'm just like, wow, it's just so much. It's so cool that they've been able to continue to tell stories like that. So it's pretty exciting, and we hope that someday, we have something that we've built something that will be able to to stand next to those proudly.
The reason why I wanted to mention that is because I wanted to bring it up in this next question. Previously, they said that they want Overwatch to be around for 10 years plus, and also really like the way that World of Warcraft was around for 10 years plus. So I asked, why is the game a sequel and not something like World of Warcraft, The Burning Crusade, Wrath of the Lich King, those kind of expansions on top of the base game? Why Overwatch 2? And would we ever see something like an Overwatch 3 as they progress through the story?
I don't think there's a technical constraint there. As for why we're making a sequel, I think the scope of our vision for what we wanted to do with the next product was what defined it being a sequel. I remember when I joined the team talking to people about, the game. In some ways, the game that we're making now with Overwatch 2 is the game that they've always wanted to make. Having a PvE experience alongside the PvP is the full realization of the original plan. And so it's that breadth and that scope of experience that I think is what's driving us towards a sequel product. One thing I try and remind folks, I've talked to a lot of different audiences today, and sometimes it's easy for even us on the team to kind of forget, because we've gotten so much better at it now than even we were when we first started, is we run this game as a live, living, breathing thing every month. We have patches sometimes multiple times a week. We deliver content and features over the course of 3.5 years previously, and that is our intent on an ongoing basis, even after Overwatch 2 releases. We believe that that's a key part of what the community wants, and a key part of what product offering that we're saying to people, hey, this is why you want to be part of the Overwatch universe. So it's not exactly the same as what World of Warcraft is, but we hope that it gives people what they want out of the universe.
Now that's the big question I wanted to highlight. There's no other Q&A bits there, but I did want to give my impressions on what this means. I don't think that Blizzard are really BSing here. I don't think it's a case of they wanted more money, so they wanted to sell it as a sequel. They also mentioned that the game didn't have any constraints with its engine, which I find really bizarre. But there are good examples of games that have made a sequel, but then built off of that. I think the best example is Destiny 2. They wanted to create Destiny 2 to be a bigger scope than Destiny 1 was, to have the game built in such a way that it can last as long as it has. I can definitely see a world where Overwatch 2 is the final Overwatch game that we get, and we get expansions on top of that, as opposed to Overwatch 3, 4, 5, and 6, or whatever. Much in the same way that Destiny has gone about Forsaken and now Shadowkeep. I think the way that Overwatch 1 was created and monetized, most importantly, wasn't good enough to build off it in the same way that Blizzard wanted to. So not only is Overwatch 2 going to be this big PvE game, but they can better balance the game for PvP and just build off of this whole Overwatch 2 structure by adding in future game modes and different ways to play from that. And that's how games like this progress. Path of Exile is a really good example of that. It had a base game, but then its expansions add replayability on top of that. Borderlands 2 as well, with all of its DLCs and things that you can do to level up and gear up. But to begin with, it was just a base game, the problem that Borderlands 3 has at the moment. But I guess Blizzard didn't want to build off Overwatch 1 because of the engine, because they did say that they can't really do more PvE content on the engine that Overwatch 1 currently has. But also, loot boxes are a pretty bad way for them to monetize the game. So I can see Overwatch 2 definitely having some form of battle pass, and adding expansions on top of that game in the future, but that's just my impression. I don't think that this is some bullshit answer for them to just try and make more money. I believe them when they say that they wanted to make sure that the sequel fitted their scope and idea of what the game would be, not only for when it releases, but also going into the future. The area that Overwatch 1 fell apart on. It launched tremendously, but as we know, the future of the game since then has been pretty bleak, let's be honest. But that's everything I wanted to go over in this interview. Sorry for adding my own spin at the end, but I really did want to give my impressions. PvE games are really important to me. I covered Anthem for Christ's sake, so I know what a game could do wrong. But that's just my opinions. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. We'll see you then.